In terms of your automation, I'm going to give you this advice. Try to break it. The last little tip and trick here, so only the people that stay to the very end get this one. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode. This is a third video in a 3-part series all about building automation, so I will link those below. The first one is about what is an automation, what are the components of an automation, how to think about the components of an automation. The second one is how to design the automation requirements. How do you think about it and make sure that what you're designing is not going to come back and bite you in the ass. Because I can promise you that that's automation's specialty. Because it's a computer. It's just going to follow your instructions. If you give it crappy instructions, it's going to do crappy things. I have worked with a lot of clients and I have saved up my horror story for this video. So if you're starting at part 3, when you go back, that's the story I'm going to tell you in this video about what happens when automation design is not thought through 100% of the time, and how that literally costs a client I know of, however much their contacts are worth to them. Like however much your audience, however much time and energy you spend collecting emails from your audience, however much that is worth to you, I can tell you about an automation that accidentally was deleting those. We'll save the best for last. In this video though, I basically want to define how you make your requirement bulletproof. Before we dive into that, my name is Alyssa Schaefer. I am a consultant. Obviously I didn't start as a senior resource, but as I have been able to work with many clients, I've gotten to see a ton of different scenarios in which I have been confronted with many of the same from just through totally different scenarios. And it's very fun actually after you build up this arsenal. Let's dive into this third video on requirements, which is how to make your requirements bulletproof. So video 1 was about what a requirement is, what are the components what an automation is, and what are the components of one. And those are trigger, criteria, and outcome. Now, I am not going to rehash that video, so link. Video number 2 was about how to think about defining and designing automation requirements. And those rules are the 95-5 rule, forwards and backwards. And third, designing with the end in mind. Again, not gonna rehash it. Those are 2 full-blown videos, link there. So that brings us though to the third one, which is how to make your automation bulletproof. And then as a bonus, I'm gonna tell you a horror story. In terms of, this is actually really simple. In order to make your automation bulletproof, you need to test it thoroughly. So I would suggest that you test it in a sandbox environment, meaning you're testing it in a testing environment. You then test it in a production environment, so in a real live environment where you're playing with fire a little bit. When you are testing it in a sandbox, I'm going to give you this advice. Try to break it. Some of you might be thinking like, wow, that's insane. Like I just spent all this time building an automation and she's telling me to break it. That's the point. If you can break it, it's not ready yet. And with automation, if you think through the lens of, okay, I've totally thought through, I went through video 1, video 2, and I've thought all of this through, I'm ready. So then you put it up for testing, and I would recommend that the person who tests it is different from the person who built it, because you come in with a preconceived bias of how it's supposed to work. So if you have somebody else test it, in my particular circumstance, I have a coworker of mine that always tests my stuff because he is a phenomenal breaker. To be honest with you, the person who built it is too close to see it. That is the difference between, looking through this lens and looking through that lens and then trying to give somebody an instruction. In terms of your automation and testing it in this manner, it also defines and shows you how intuitive your designs are. You're selling the aspect that you are able to design something that works better, faster, stronger. Insert lovely outcome here. If it's not bulletproof, how can you say that it's any of those things? I have a particular coworker that I always have test my stuff because he's great at breaking things. But that is my advice to you, is that if you are in the testing stage of your automation, in terms of your outcome, making sure that all the boxes you are expecting to be checked get checked. And actually you check that the boxes are checked. Sorry, I said the word check a lot. But the point is, in order for it to be bulletproof, you have to not only test it based on what you expect to happen, but you're testing it based on what you're not expecting to happen. And that's why you separate the tester from the builder, because a builder is going to test it to make sure that the building works, but a person who is testing it to make sure the function works and the application of it works is not thinking about what was built or how it was built. They are thinking through a completely different lens, which is why it's such a powerful tool. And if you don't think your automation's up for snuff, then it's going to break anyway. So with that being said, that is my, for testing, it's really just, tip number one is test it, try to break it. That is, seriously, try to break it. And the second one is have somebody else test it than the person who designed it and even the person that built it, because you can define what you think should happen for anybody testing something by separating, the person who built it from the person who tested it. You take out everybody. I don't know about you guys, but when I do work, I'm proud of the work that I do. And so when I'm testing something, if it's work I did, I'm really proud of the fact that it's even there. So if you are, it's kind of like somebody calling your baby ugly. Yeah, it might happen. And it's happened to me more than once, because when you're in it and you're in the thick of it, you don't think about it. And that's okay, because that's why you have a tester to come back and be like, oh, hey, did you think about this? And you're like, oh, my baby's missing an ear or something along those lines. So I'm going to tell everybody a horror story now about a client. And again, my other disclaimer, whenever I tell a client scenario, I do not call out the client. I'm not trying to share personal or professional information about anybody that I've ever worked with in the past. I am only trying to paint a scenario so that everybody in the room gets a little wiser on what could happen if we don't properly go through designing the automation steps that I've outlined in these 3 videos. Company X that I was working with, and this was actually the way that I ended up working with them, was they worked with a different consultant to build the thing that I'm about to describe to you. So when I started working with them, they were under the impression this thing was working. And then eventually they came to the table and said, oh, this thing doesn't work. And I was like, oh, well, what was it supposed to do? And had to, really rehash the history of it. And it took a really long time to do this. This is hindsight being 2020 is a really hard lens to look through when it comes to trying to undo what somebody did. But the problem with this particular circumstance is the automation they built is they said, in scenario A, do this, and then delete that. So I guess I'll even say that what they were trying to do was they were trying to automatically associate contacts with accounts. And so what would happen is they didn't define specifically enough. They had 4 email fields. So they didn't design specifically enough what email field should really be the main source of truth. So what would happen is they would have contacts with the first email, and then when a second email got added, it would trigger the automation. But if the second email that was added was a personal email, that would then trigger a different automation, and then the other automation was saying, oh, okay, well, delete it. And long story short, they had been deleting their contacts accidentally for a year. When I first found out that the thing was deleting stuff, I was like, oh, that's bad. But, ultimately had no reason to believe that the first defined version of this automation wasn't exactly what they wanted. But what really happened, the scenario of what really happened was when these 2 automations mixed together. So they built this automation over here. It was all this stuff, it was very clearly thought out. I don't know if it was well thought out, but it was thought out. It was very long and complicated, and I called it the devil flow. Let's just put it that way. Obviously they took a lot of time and effort to do this. But what happened is when this part of the workflow would trigger, and then that mixed with this other automation that they had set up, which kind of, not that it had nothing to do with that, but it was totally separate. and not part of the definition of this one. When when they mix together, what ended up happening, long story short, because this isn't about me saying like don't do this, but they were automatically deleting their contacts. That is the risk you run by one, not, so all three of these videos, not understanding what requirements are, not not clearly defining what requirements are, but then also not thoroughly testing when things, thinking through all the different possible scenarios of how this could happen, not happen, unhappen, all that stuff. All that needs to be taken into account. And to answer your question, yes, it's really complicated, and this is why I have a job. And this is also why my job takes hours on end. I always find that people think it's like, they think it's that I'm like overestimating how many hours I need, and it's like, no, actually, my job is mostly thinking. But in order to think through all those scenarios, that takes a lot of time. And as long as you're invested in the outcome being right the first time, then that's an easy price to pay. Because if I told you that in scenario A with the first consultant that you were going to lose, and actually I don't even know how many, however, so say they get 30,000 new contacts a year. They could have easily deleted up to, who knows how often they would do that, add another email, who knows? But if I told you that by not thinking it through, the cost was going to be losing half of your contacts, like all of a sudden the price that somebody's asking you for in terms of like a consulting bill is small potatoes in comparison. Hopefully these videos have served you, parts 1, 2, and 3, which of course links everywhere to all of those, so that everybody is on the same page when it at least comes to how to think about automation and defining requirements, and most importantly, how to test so thoroughly that at least beyond reasonable doubt that you're not going to accidentally be shooting yourself in the foot later. And I guess I should also add as a caveat, and this is just the last little tip and trick here, so only the people that stay to the very end get this one. But one thing that I would say about building automation is I find everybody wants to have automation before they have a process. And unless you have a manual process that you already know how it works and how it should work, it's really hard to start with automation. You have to first start with a manual process that you can then automate. I find that people think like, oh, I'm just going to build this automation. And I'm like, oh, cool. Like, so what's your sales process like? And they're like, what? And I'm like, oh, well, how are we going to know what to automate if we don't know what the process is? That's my last little nugget for you, is that unless you know the manual process, you're never going to be able to automate, at least successfully. Not the first try anyway. So I wish everybody luck with building their automations. Check out the links in the description if you want to keep going on this journey. Don't forget to use the button that looks like this, and then subscribe and turn on notifications, because I promise you, I am going to keep posting on this channel. I have long called myself the wizard behind the curtain. I am pulling up the curtain, guys, because when you work with a consultant, you have access to going faster, building better designs in the first place. I feel good. Being able to access not just somebody who is thinking through your lens and your business application, but all businesses. Like I've worked in, I worked in a lot of different industries before I became a Salesforce consultant. But if we take my Salesforce consulting and then apply it to how many businesses I worked with within the lens of that, all of a sudden I have seen these solutions applied in almost every single area. Well, no, let's not say that, because there's always more to be learned. But I will say that there, it's more than most on the number of different industries I have seen these solutions be applied to. And I know everybody thinks they're a special unicorn, but I can promise you that I have seen solutions for real estate agents work just as well for people in the health and wellness space. So you tell me. Am I wrong, or is it just being able to think outside the box a little bit to be like, what's the simplest and fastest solution, plus something that's not going to bite me in the ass later? So good luck with designing your automations. I can't wait to hear how it goes. And I sincerely hope that through this video, that when you test it, that at least one problem is found. Because if you don't break it successfully when you test it, I would be a little worried about it. Just saying. So I will see you on the next one, and thanks for sticking around.